Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Daniel Goldsmith, an educator and a spiritual practitioner. Daniel has been teaching in the humanities department at Dawson College in Montreal since 2009. His courses deal with questions of self-identity, compassionate action, and enlightened consciousness. His teachings draw on his formal education. He got both his BA and MA from McGill University, as well as on the nearly 2 years he spent in India learning about yoga and meditation. Daniel is also a Certified Core Energetics Practitioner, CCEP, and is currently working on developing pedagogical activities that integrate body and mind. Our guest has already put together several Embodied Philosophy workshops and is currently organizing a Buddhism-inspired somatic retreat. Moreover, Daniel is currently recruiting participants for a research project exploring the confluence of waking up, spiritual practices to reveal the ultimate nature of reality, and cleaning up, psychological shadow work. Daniel, welcome. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Paul.
What a fascinating and unique portfolio. I have so many questions, but I think the best place to start would be with core energetics. What is core energetics, or what does it mean to be a practitioner of core energetics?
I'll start with the second question. When people ask me what I do as a practitioner, it's quite simple. I help people to feel their feelings. And core energetics is a modality, it's a technique in order to really go deeply into the body, not just to talk about how we might be feeling angry or afraid, but really to energize that and to feel that deeply.
So what led you to wanting to study core energetics and be a practitioner?
The short answer is suffering. And it was about 8 years ago, I was having terrible insomnia after the birth of my second son, and I tried everything. And I also noticed that as a result of my enfeebled state, I was lashing out. There was a lot of anger coming out towards my children. And I made a resolution that I didn't want to have them grow up with a father who didn't know how to relate to his own anger. So I started looking around, and I found a core energetics practitioner. I started moving my anger. I wasn't clear at first that was what was at stake, but the more that I did that, then the better I slept. And so after that, I just got really interested and started going into other emotions like fear and sadness. And now I'm at a point where I really want to be able to offer this work and what I've learned and how impactful it's been for me to others.
It's very interesting. To clarify, did the insomnia result from having a second child and the stress and burdens involved with having a second child?
I think children mirror back to us all of the unconscious parts of ourselves that we haven't dealt with. The anger was always there. I hadn't had a space to really feel it, primarily because of the conditioning in my upbringing around anger. It wasn't safe for me to feel my anger when I was growing up. And so I learned to swallow it, and that served me for a time, but eventually I paid a price for it. It took a toll. And my body was manifesting these physical symptoms that were calling my attention to an emotional dysregulation. And eventually I also discovered dysregulations in other parts of my being, in my volition, my will, and ultimately my spirituality as well.
Wow. Did you always have an interest in spirituality, or did it start with core energetics?
Oh, my interest in spirituality predates core energetics. And one of the reasons why I was drawn to core is that it makes room for the spiritual dimension of who we are. It's an outgrowth of bioenergetics, which itself is an outgrowth of Wilhelm Reich's work, who is a disciple of Freud. So it does trace itself back to Freud, but the spiritual component was missing in bioenergetics, and that's the key difference. Spirituality chose me. I did not want to go on a spiritual journey. In fact, quite the opposite. I was pretty militantly atheist when I was growing up. And again, it was suffering that brought me into asking myself deeper questions. When I was in Nepal, I was deeply unhappy, trying to avoid feeling that through various methods of drug-induced hazes and distractions. And then I, with nothing left to lose, one day I said, well, why didn't I try out meditation? I had taken a course at McGill on Hinduism and Buddhism, and I started getting really interested in that. And then I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat, and that was 20 years ago. I traveled to India and Nepal after that.
You've talked about suffering more than once now. You mentioned it twice. Suffering has a lot of connotations, I would assume. And the way you said it really made me feel the suffering or the pain that you went through. What is suffering?
I am informed on that question by the Buddhist notion of what's called dukkha, which is the first noble truth in the Buddha's teachings, which gets translated as suffering in English. And it's a bit of a misnomer because it actually points to this reality of what you might call persistent dissatisfaction. There's always something in our human experience that doesn't feel quite right. Like even when we have it all, there's still this underlying anxiety or fear that it might be taken away. I often quote Oscar Wilde. He says, there are two ways of being miserable. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it. So we don't often equate getting what we want with being miserable. But I had a sense of like I had a good education, I was successful in the eyes of the world, and yet there was something deeper that was longing to come out that hadn't found quite a way of vocabulary at McGill. And so that's when going into my body, into where the suffering was taking place, that was really the start of it, the catalyst.
So the suffering, if I understood you correctly, relates to your own happiness and balance in life?
The suffering can be physical in the insomnia example, or it can be more subtle, like, okay, I feel like there's more to this life than I'm being told. I feel like I'm much bigger than the box that I've put myself into.
That's so interesting. So you're asking questions about who you are and your place in the world. If I'm not mistaken, I think you have a background in philosophy.
Correct.
So did you start asking these questions as a result of your studies in philosophy? And if so, how does that relate to spirituality?
There was always a seed in me for these larger existential questions. I remember when I was about 10 years old and I was lying awake in bed and I was going backwards in time, trying to remember everything that I could of my life. And then I got to my birth, which I didn't consciously remember, but I started asking myself, where was I before I was born? And I came in contact with this, for lack of a better way of putting it, like this void, this emptiness out of which I arose. And I was completely fascinated and terrified by that. And then when I tried to speak to my parents and other adults, they weren't exactly receptive to that type of questioning. So that seed then drew me to philosophy because here we were, there's a discipline that tries to wrestle with these questions. And spirituality, spiritual traditions are also wrestling with this larger question of who am I? Is there a purpose to why I'm here?
That's so fascinating. I've heard people say before that when you study philosophy, sometimes it raises more questions than answers, and it can kind of screw people up a little bit. In your case, philosophy opened your horizons?
Sure. And it is correct that, there's more, for every answer that you get, there's more questions. I wouldn't describe my encounters with philosophy, spirituality, or core energetics as resolving anything. It's just opened the door to more and more, like slicing through an onion where you just get to progressively finer and finer layers, and there's no center to it. And that can be very frustrating to our desire, which I think is also culturally encouraged in this particular culture, of wanting to find some type of fixed, solid resolution, some place that we can, put ourselves on and be confident, that just doesn't exist in reality. So philosophy is more of a process. It's not a destination.
So that void that was bothering you when you were younger, is the answer to addressing that void being present in the moment, learning to live in the now in a way?
That could be one part of it. And to realize that actually that void out of which we all emerged, we're continuing to emerge out of it. It's not just before we were born, there was blankness, emptiness, nothingness, that in many theistic traditions, they describe the action of God creating the world not as a past historical event, but as an ongoing process. So right now, we might not be aware or conscious, but where are our thoughts coming from? That's one example of, like, if I sit back and I get quiet, yeah, it does indeed seem like that is popping out of this, again, for lack of a better way of putting it, pregnant void.
I'm just curious about the void. Have you dealt with the idea of the void, or is it something that's ongoing?
So, to put it intellectually, I would say that what we call being and what we call nothingness, these are two sides of the same coin, that one can't exist without the other. And so this is the dynamic interplay between revealing and concealing. And one side is not better than the other. They co-constitute each other. They're equiprimordial.
So ultimately, you're interested in doing all sorts of activities that can help you gain a better understanding of your being as a way of complementing as opposed to counteracting the void that you felt as a child?
Right. To actually feel it. Because that intuition that I had as a child points to a very profound truth that is expressed in the Buddhist tradition that's called emptiness, which is basically that nothing in this material world has any solid, independent existence. Another way of putting it would be to say we are groundless. And that, when you actually face that head on, it creates a lot of anxiety. Like, wait a minute, when I describe who I am, every single thing that I want to put there, it just kind of falls through my hands. The Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa said, it's like you're jumping out of an airplane and you have no parachute. But the good news is there is no ground.
Yeah.
So can we learn to make friends with the groundlessness and to realize that actually anxiety is a very intelligent response to the reality of groundlessness. We talk a lot about anxiety in this culture, and many people are being medicated for anxiety. I think if you're not anxious, you're not paying attention.
If you're not anxious, you're not paying attention.
Yeah, you may have found other ways to deal with your anxiety by constructing some sense of self that you feel comfortable in, that you can hold on to. But ultimately, we're free floating and very vulnerable. And if you really, we're on a floating rock ball in the middle of space. And one day I mysteriously popped into this existence through seemingly no will of my own, to parents who I maybe chose, maybe didn't, into a historical time period that I didn't choose, a body, gender, all that stuff. Like, wait a minute, like, how did this happen? And, also the knowledge that I might die at any point. This is our reality, right? This is the angst that the existentialists talk about. So that's normal, that's healthy. And when we really feel into it, we can gain a lot of insight instead of trying to avoid it.
Wow. So groundlessness, is that the ticket to combating anxiety?
Yeah, learning to surf the wave in a way. Learning to recognize that, I don't have any ground, and any attempt that I make to find a ground will just cause more dukkha, more suffering.
It's interesting. I'm talking to you and I'm looking at you, and you're exuding a nice energy, and you seem to be well grounded, for a lack of a better term. Did your studies or your interest in philosophy and then spirituality and I guess the answers you've been finding to the questions you've been asking, has that made you a stronger person? Perhaps stronger is not the good word or the right word, but what has that made you?
It's transformed me in the sense that I'm able to offer more of myself. All of these explorations, philosophy, meditation, core energetics, have led me to really look into what qualities, what strengths do I have that I can bring into this world in a way that the world needs, in a compassionate way. And if I have something that excites me and I'm not doing that, why? And that's such a fascinating question because I can play the victim card and say, oh, it's because other people might reject me or they can't handle it. But actually, no, it's because I'm afraid to bring this part out into the world. And that itself is conditioned by past experiences.
So you're learning to let go and be yourself and be more authentic
Yeah,
in your presence and your beingness in the world. And through that authenticity, you're able to give back to people around you.
absolutely. I'm very grateful to all of my Buddhist training that has really hammered home at every step that the motivation for any spiritual journey, the best is to be more compassionate. And that's a point that they share in common really with all spiritual traditions. So I do this work on myself for myself because it benefits me, I suffer less, but also because it enables me to give more to others in a way that I'm truly uniquely gifted and talented.
I'm going to ask something, and it just came to my mind. You did this for yourself to give to others. Is that a selfish act or is it a selfless act?
Good question. And I really go back and forth with this about, and I just even asking yourself the question, what is my intention? Already, that's a huge step. And so I'm not going to lie that there's part of me that wants to get better so that I don't have to suffer as much. Is that a selfish motivation? Perhaps. In my meditation practice, I end each of it by dedicating the merits, the benefits of my practice to the welfare of others. So I do it while always keeping in mind, okay, this is too valuable, it's too precious, I can't keep it to myself. And at a certain point, I feel so full. It's like a full cup that cannot help but overflow in order to make room for more. So there's a natural extension of wanting to offer it out to others. It's part of it. And we can reference a lot of philosophical thought experiments like Plato and the allegory of the cave and various examples of the hero's journey that talk about this process of going down into the abyss, challenging yourself, confronting something, and then returning back to society to share the boons.
So the selfishness is a necessary step towards selflessness.
Right. That it's like scaffolding that you can use to build a building. It's necessary at first to put up, to erect the wall, but then at some point it can get taken down. So if you embark on the journey of enlightenment, it's almost always going to be for selfish motivations because you want to get enlightened, whatever that means. But then the process of engaging with those teachings and those practices gradually effaces the ego and the sense of clinging to oneself almost by magic.
The image of the overflowing cup was very powerful, and I think that really hit home for me. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So you give embodied philosophy workshops. What are those workshops?
So this is an outgrowth of activities that I've pioneered with Dawson students. I like to joke that I have a captive audience there. So they're my guinea pigs and I can test things out. And then I've been publicly offering to anybody who's interested in. So far, we've had 2 such evenings. There's more in my pocket that I'd like to do in the future. But one was on Plato. And we took Socrates' trial and we brought it to life. We role played the Athenians who accused Socrates of disbelief in the gods and corrupting the youth. That was the first part. And then we reenacted the allegory of the cave, which was a lot of fun because I set people up and then I played the prisoner who was trying to free them and they had to feel into the resistance. And in both of these cases, we saw direct connections to our everyday life and to our contemporary world. And that's one thing that's really been important for me in philosophy is I don't like abstract thought experiments that stay in the ivory tower. I want to know how does this relate to my life and how can this help me to lead a better life? So that was always my aim at McGill, and that's what I try to do here. And then the second one was on Nietzsche and this very provocative concept that he has called the Übermensch or the Overman. And so we read from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I led the group through what Nietzsche called the three metamorphoses, and through these three stages of progressively becoming more of who you are.
Wow, and I'm sure students loved it.
You know, it's always interesting when I ask them to stand up and take a breath and feel what's going on. It's like our entire school system has not prepared them to do anything like that. They're just, treated as brains on a stick, as I was, and, learn the information, regurgitate it out, and that's what we call intelligence. And there's a total disconnection from emotions, from interpersonal relationships. So it is a bit of a challenge, but they usually get into it because it feels good. It feels good to, have permission to enact, at least in the case of Socrates, let's energize blame. Let's play the Athenians. They're like, it's your fault. And then feel the pleasure in that, realize where else this has happened throughout history, tons of examples, and also realize where you are doing that in your life. Who are you blaming? Can you feel the pleasure that's in that? Can you feel the sense of power that you get? Are you trying to avoid something? And so for students who are ready, this can really open up a lot of really profound areas for them.
Do you connect those emotions to the content of the philosopher's texts you're looking at?
I mean, there's a little bit of creative interjection here. Like I am inferring, for example, that the reason why the prisoners in the allegory of the cave don't turn around is because they're afraid. Mm. They're afraid to give up what they thought what reality was, the shadows on the wall. They're comfortable in their community, and they would rather lash out at somebody trying to bring them the truth than actually have the courage to confront that maybe their entire life was an illusion. So Plato doesn't say that directly in the text, but I think it's a perfectly legitimate interpretation.
And it might inspire the students, the brains on the sticks, to go read Plato.
For
further.
sure.
Yeah, interesting.
And they understand the material in a way that's going to stick with them. Because when you learn something cognitively, you're very likely to forget it. But when you've learned something somatically through the body, then there's more likelihood that you're actually going to remember that later on.
I still love that expression, brain on stick. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's going to stick with me.
I mean, we are a culture of brains on a stick. And forgive me for saying, but McGill and other universities, these are temples to the mind, where really that is just about the only dimension of the human being that is being seen and valued and evaluated. And McGill produces a lot of very smart people, but that are completely out of touch with their bodies and their emotions and maybe can't even have any, interpersonal relationships. These are all skills, all qualities of being a well-rounded person that get completely obliterated in the rush for more information.
One last question before we talk history.
Yeah.
Core energetics, how has that inspired your embodied philosophy workshops?
So CORE has provided me with the tools and the framework for these workshops. So one of the tools that we use is a foam cube with a sort of a bat that is used to help generate energy, or to help feel. So for example, when one of the play acting prisoners was saying, no, I don't want to turn around, I had them hit on the cube and really feel like their resistance, like, no, like shouting, no, I don't want to turn around. And of course, I was helping them to connect it with like, there are certain truths in their lives that they are refusing to see, right? So that they could feel that that no was not just the no of some fictional mythology 2,500 years ago, but this is a no that belongs to them. It belongs to all humans. And so in core, it's very powerful to give people permission to say no. You'd be really surprised at how challenging and how provocative just being able to say no is. And then it can bring up a lot of feelings in people. Like maybe they weren't encouraged or allowed to say no when they were younger. Maybe every time they tried to put a boundary, worse things happen. So core gives a vocabulary for the developmental aspect of that then I can bring in, and I can track people like, okay, like if you are telling me like, I was hitting and I was feeling good in the no, but now I'm feeling confused. I have an idea of what's going on in the energy system. Or, oh, I'm such a bad person for doing this. Like there's certain common phrases that people repeat that then in the core energetics model, I can situate where they're at, and then I can point out to them, hey, by the way, when you're judging, why are you doing that? Is it because maybe you're not wanting to feel something? If you weren't judging, what would you be feeling? So that really helps to dig underneath the surface.
So core really helps to self-explore, discover one's own raw energies in a way?
Yeah. I mean, core is an acronym for Center of Right Energy. So that's ultimately what we're trying to contact in the model of core. And to get to that core, we have to, first of all, penetrate the mask, which is our protection against the shadow elements of ourself, what's called the lower self in core. It's the part of us that wants to sabotage and hurt and stay separate. And most of the time, we're not conscious of that. So we develop strategies so that we don't admit those things about ourselves. And then once we come in contact with the lower self, then there's a tremendous amount of energy that gets unlocked, and we can realize that we're making a choice on how to use that energy. And then we can choose, do I want to use it for separation and duality, or do I want to come into unified experience and use this from my deepest talents to serve the world?
And its relation to Reich earlier you talked about.
Yeah.
Was it William Reich?
Yes.
Was it his notion of orgons, and you need to exhaust that energy that's in you? Like the more you exhaust it, the more at one you become?
I mean, Reich is a very controversial and complex figure. I think a lot of the techniques and the methods that he had were just a little bit too far out there, and they did get him in trouble. What he brought to the table, though, was this notion that psychoanalysis can't just be two guys on a couch talking. Stand up, move your body, because that is where you are experiencing things. The mind, the idea is an afterthought. It comes 3 steps down the road from the actual feeling embodied experience.
That's a strong argument.
Well, we could check it out for ourselves, I feel like everything that I'm sharing with you, if we wanted to test it out in a laboratory, go really slowly, we could see that, this Western Cartesian dualism of the separation of body and mind, this is totally fictitious. I call it the body mind, like body-mind.
And did Freud have a very negative reaction to what Reich was saying, or? Because it's kind of far out. He's like taking Freud further.
Yeah. And, keep in mind, Freud had a number of disciples, Carl Jung and others that, hit Freud's discovery of the unconscious was monumental, and talks about neuroses and stuff, even if we disagree with a lot of his conclusions. But just to make us recognize that the conscious self is just, the tip of the iceberg. And, Freud had his own misgivings about the body, about religion. And so it was in the hands of these people that took it afterwards to really develop those trails.
So he did the hard work just by bringing it to our attention, and then the others obviously naturally did the work that was needed to be done to bring it to where we are right now.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's still ongoing. It's an evolutionary process.
Very interesting. Okay, let's talk history.
Yeah, let's do it.
What's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? Why do you think that image comes to mind?
I think about history as like a large flowing river with many different tributaries. And so, sort of, this is an imperfect metaphor, but the present moment is this river, and it's being fed by all these different sources that go back and back and back, and those sources have different sources. And so this image comes to mind because the present moment is so incredibly complex, and it has been shaped by forces that are far outside of it, in just the same way that if we went down to the Saint Laurent, we could trace it back to a little creek in northern Ontario.
What is your earliest memory of your connection to history?
So two came to mind. One was I was about 6 years old, and I was watching the nightly news back when such a thing existed, and we all kind of lived in a similar reality before we got all siloed. And the Berlin Wall was coming down. And I remember saying to my mom, it looks like they're having a civil war over there. So there was something in me, even at a young age, that was fascinated by what's happening? And so my mom was explaining the Cold War, East and West Germany. And then I was like, yeah, but wait, how does the wall go from the border of East Germany and then go all the way into Berlin? I was trying to make sense of this, but I was just really curious by how it came to be.
So many questions.
Yeah. And part of that was linked to the fact that my grandfather, so my mom's father, fought in World War II and was captured and almost died. So there was this very direct connection with that historical event. And then the other memory was a little bit older, maybe 9 or 10 years old. I wrote to my grandmother asking her to tell me everything that she knew about the family. And she wrote me back this letter with like a family tree and, here was your great grandfather. And so I again, this sense of like, I want to know where I come from. I want to know the force. I want to know all the tributaries that have led to the river of me.
Were all these questions you asked your mom and your grandmother, were they connected to your misgivings regarding the void?
Well, shall we talk about what I think history is?
We're going to get there,
Okay.
But I want to hear about the void. Or do you want to talk about the void later?
Well,
maybe it's not even connected.
Let's just put it this way. I think that when we try to establish a narrative structure, it's in an attempt to not feel the void.
Okay, interesting. All right, so we're going to keep that thought and we're going to...
More on that later.
More on that, yeah, because I want to ask you another question then. Could you please describe a moment in time, an incident, or an episode in your professional or everyday life where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a certain goal, for making some kind of change, positive change through your work or through your everyday actions? And what was your justification for using history?
So there's two examples that come to mind. One is in the worldviews class that I teach at Dawson. It's called Enlightened Consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it's an exploration of the commonalities in different spiritual traditions. And we practice meditation. And it's pretty far out there in a very secular culture like Quebec that has this knee-jerk aversion, rightfully so, to organized religion. So for me to come in and teach a course that's not even in the religious studies department, but that is thoroughly saturated by religious teachings, it can be a very thorny situation because you have some atheists, you have people coming from different backgrounds. But I like to justify, I like to point out at every point along the way that I'm not making up anything new, that I'm looking back within each tradition, noting figures, quotes, practices, and I'm using that to sort of give myself more legitimacy. So that's why I want to look back to history to kind of, to protect myself as an educator. I don't want to be accused of trying to corrupt the youth, sneak religion in through the back door. Like, no, this is an academic subject that we can study in a historical way. And I do feel that students get more out of it the more they make it personal and can connect it to their life, which is why we do secular meditations, nothing coming from any particular tradition. So that's one. And then the other example is in my knowledge class where I discuss Socrates. We spend a lot of time unpacking the history around what was going on in Athens at that time. And the reason I do that is to point out that there are a lot of parallels with other times in history, including, and perhaps very importantly, especially our own time. That, there's that expression, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so we're seeing again, for the umpteenth time in history, how democracy can be slowly eroded and lead to authoritarianism. Plato knew this. Socrates knew this. And that's part of the reason why they distrusted democracy. They didn't feel that average citizens had the capacity to make rational, informed choices about leadership. They could be too easily swayed by emotions and by rhetoric. And so I use this as a way of saying, hey guys, like if you're feeling any discomfort about what's going on right now, it's happened before. And maybe we can learn a thing or two about how to navigate it, or at least at a minimum to kind of try to diagnose the problem.
I love that. So you're using history to trigger your students' curiosity and their understanding that context is important. So you're using history to justify why you're teaching about the historical context at the time of the ancient Greeks, for example. And you're also using history as a way to justify your own thinking as to why you're integrating something that's non-conventional into a course or a program that would perhaps expect you to teach the topic in another way.
Right. And
so it's for personal reasons, but also for convincing your students.
Right. And, I just want to be clear that I'm within the pedagogical framework as it's outlined, that we teach towards competencies and not towards content in the humanities department. And so
what competencies?
Right. So the competency for worldviews, a student isn't expected to learn specific content in a worldviews class. What they are expected to do is acquire the competency about being able to describe what a worldview is and contrast it, compare it with their own worldview. So I have colleagues who do teach like ancient Greek, ancient Mayan worldviews, indigenous worldviews. There's a lot of different content. I use the framework of what's called the perennial philosophy, which is a way of talking about all these similarities throughout time, as a way of saying this is a worldview as well. Just like we have sources for the Mayan worldview, we have sources for this too. The point is for you to study it, to understand it, and then to see, okay, how does this differ? How does this challenge your own worldview that you've grown up with? I liken it to wearing glasses, where we all have grown up with a worldview that are like lenses that are shaping the way that we see the world. And so in a worldviews class, you're being asked to try on another set of glasses. How would the world look like if I had these sets of values, if I interpreted things this way? And then at the end of the course, if you like it, then maybe you can integrate those glasses into your own glasses. And if not, fine, just throw them in the trash afterwards. But the key thing is you have to try them on to really understand.
That's convincing. That's very good. So you're looking at spirituality historically.
Exactly.
And you're also looking at history for context.
Yes, you got it.
Very good. Very, very fascinating. I have a little side question. More than once, you referred to, indirectly perhaps, to spirituality as a religion. And then you talked about atheism. So I was wondering, are spirituality and religion similar, or are they very different? And can you be an atheist and be a spiritual atheist?
Right. We actually spend about a week unpacking that question in that course.
Okay.
What is the difference between religion and spirituality? Usually when people say the word religion, they're talking about organized institutional religion. And to be critical of that is as easy as shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, we can find plenty of examples, which were the source of my atheism as a youth. I looked at the way I grew up in a very conservative part of Colorado, and I looked at the way that so-called Christians around me were judging and condemning and hating others. And I'm like, well, if that's what religion is, then I don't want to have anything to do with it. And then, there was 9/11 when I was 18 years old. Look back in history, Inquisition, Crusades, etc. Right? So organized religion has been responsible for perpetrating some horrific atrocities. And for a lot of people, even people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, the new atheist, that's been enough just to completely reject religion as a whole and saying, we don't want any of it, we don't need any of it. And then there are these spiritual practices, which tend to be more inner, individual focus about cultivating a deeper sense of peace, deeper sense of purpose. Have those practices been part of organized religions? Absolutely. And so if somebody's coming from a religious institution or a tradition, they'll find spirituality in there. But just because you're part of that doesn't automatically make you spiritual. You might just be going along with it to follow the rules or to make yourself feel more comfortable about where you're going after you die, et cetera, et cetera. There might actually be no transformation of consciousness, which is really what spirituality is about. So religion can support spirituality, but spirituality can be practiced outside of the context of organized religion.
So you can be an atheist and transform your understanding of consciousness.
Totally. And you might even be, I would encourage you to cherry pick from religious rituals that attempt to cultivate this deeper sense of consciousness. So, for instance, Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, you go around asking for forgiveness to people who you might have wronged. And I'm like, man, that's such a good idea. Like once a year, the community gets together and be like, my bad. I'm really sorry for that. I'm going to try to do better. I don't care if you're Jewish or not. That is a good idea. Your life will improve as a result of that. And there's plenty of other examples that we could find.
So based on what you've said regarding your justification of using history to prove a point or to talk about or to justify a goal that you're trying to attain, and your differentiation between spirituality and religion, based on what you've said, what do you think history is? What does it serve to do?
Okay. History is the selective art of what to remember and what to forget.
Okay.
And every point of that definition, I want to go into a little bit of detail, if that's
Please
okay.
do, of course.
Okay. So let's start with art.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many historians think of themselves as dealing with stuff that actually happened and might differentiate themselves, say, from fiction writers. History was real, but fiction is not. But every way that history is written, it necessitates an artistic decision about which events to include, how to implot them, where is the beginning, what is the end. All of these are artistic liberties that historians regularly take without being conscious of it. And Aristotle pointed this out to us in the Poetics 2,400 years ago. So it's an art and it's selective. There's some deliberation into what goes in and what goes out. And it's not just about what we remember, but it's also about what we forget. Some of that forgetfulness is deliberate. Some of it is not. Some of it is selective, some of it is not. But in any historical account, we are going to need to choose how we are going to link the past with the present. And so we can't possibly account for every last little detail, every last little alternative point of view. So we have to forget in order to be able to remember anything. So that's what history is. What purpose does it serve? Two things I can think of. I think we can't speak of history outside of the moral dimension to it. And this is something that probably trained historians would react against. But every historical narrative has a moral dimension to it, whether or not you think so or not. So if we take, for example, Cold War history or Holocaust history or something like that, there might be on some level this notion coming in, we're studying this and we're learning about it because why? We don't want it to happen again? If you take that position around, for example, Holocaust education, which is very important, you're making a moral stance right there. You're saying this should not have happened. This was an evil. We should learn from our mistakes. It should not happen. So there's always this moral dimension to any narrative that you are crafting. And so that notion of right and wrong, good and bad, it helps to orient us in the world. And so getting back, the second reason to what I was saying about the void earlier, this helps us to make sense of our motion through time. And if we look really deeply, closely, we'll discover that emptiness, that groundlessness, that void. And so history is a way of like basically trying to hold on while we are in free fall.
So just to clarify, is history what historians do? Or can you and I, well, I have a background in history, but I don't identify as a historian. But can people in the everyday do history? Or is history what historians do?
I'd say that we are historical beings. You may have heard there was a book that was written called The Storytelling Animal. Human beings, we are hardwired to tell stories and to try to make sense of ourselves, our communities, our cultures, how the world came to be. If you look back even to the earliest hunting-gathering civilizations, they had stories about why things were happening, how the world came to be, their place in it. So I think that we cannot help but be historical, and the historian is doing that perhaps in a more professional way. Just like I think fundamentally all children are philosophers, and then we get to a subject called philosophy, but everybody knows how to do philosophy. Everybody is a philosopher. They have that capacity. Socrates demonstrated this in his inquiring with the underclasses of Athenian society.
Or the street kids he used to hang out with.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the slaves, basically, he would go and talk to, he got, in the Meno, he got a slave to articulate a geometrical proof just by guiding him. So, the philosopher has practice with helping us to remember what we kind of already know.
But can we do history without the historian, or do we ultimately need a historian, someone with some professional training in the art of narrating past, present, future to fill that void for us?
I think it's always good to have experts around.
Okay.
Like, you could go down to the field and play football and throw it around with the guys, That's going to be an experience. But then if you have like a professional there that can say, okay, try when you throw, hold the laces like this, your experience might improve. So I think that, his professional historians are really valuable to come and make other people aware of what they're already doing.
Okay, very interesting. So is history something that is done at an individual level, or is history also done at a broader level? Based on what you've said.
Right. So we all do it in our own personal stories. We tell a story, somebody asks you who you are, you're going to tell them a story. You're going to selectively choose what to remember and what to forget. You're going to do that in reference to what you think the other person wants to hear too. If you encounter a different person in a different context, you might narrate different events. And then also in your own internal narrative about, your progression through time. We're doing that. At the same time, Heidegger remarks that Dasein ist Mitsein. To be human is to be with. And so we can't separate ourselves out of the communal aspect. So an example individually that people might have of doing history in their mind is saying, okay, well, I did X, Y, and Z, and my goal is this. My goal is success, or whatever it is that our culture puts out there. That desire, that telos, that end, that aim, that has been put in your mind by the cultural water. Other cultures would not have that notion of, where are you supposed to be in your 30s? What are you supposed to have accomplished by the time you're 40? All this stuff that it's just part of our water that, we're like fish in the water that don't even notice it's there. And then on a collective level, that's when it gets interesting, but it also gets really dangerous. I mean, I really want to highlight, I think history is dangerous.
Okay.
Yeah. And you see it because you have political actors who try to gain control of a certain narrative that then influence other people's perception. So, I mean, we can think of many examples, even some contemporary ones of, for instance, the events of January 6th are now being narrated in a completely different way by the current administration in power. That that event, which you would think if it's an event, we can agree on what happened. There were photographers there. There's like a lot of archival evidence. But that's a really good example of how the meaning of that event changes depending on the aims that the politicians have with it. So we need to be careful about the ways that our perception of the past, which is inextricably linked to what we're going to do in the future, about how that is actually being influenced by outside actors.
So if I understand correctly, you can't really separate the individual from the collective. Like being an individual by extension means that the collective is speaking through you in many ways.
Yeah.
So we create historical knowledge on our own. We need the guidance of historians so that we don't, quote unquote, make mistakes. And the danger would lie in who controls the broader narrative. And in that sense, history could be evil.
Right.
Or dangerous.
Yeah. Paul Ricoeur talked about history as what he called pharmakon. There was this term in ancient Greek, which is it's a poison, but it's also a medicine. It depends on the dose, right? And in fact, many of our medicines are poisonous.
That's
but
right.
when they're given in the right way, they become medicinal.
Interesting.
So historians can help us open up more possibilities, or they can close those possibilities down. And we should be grateful, in recent decades, to the work of a lot of historians in the field who have made us reevaluate the story of Canada. That up until maybe 50, 60 years ago, Indigenous voices really weren't present there. So that's an example of the medicinal use of history.
So it can be used for good purposes and for bad purposes.
Yeah, depending on the aims of the actor. And it's inexorably political as well.
Okay, interesting. Because my next question was, is history bad or good, or is it both? So could you perhaps expand more on the latter point you were making about how good history can be? Still using that metaphor of medicine, like the dosage?
Yeah. So let's take it back to the individual level. I think it makes more sense there. So I am always free to narrate the events of my past in a different way. There's and this is this is an expression of groundlessness, of emptiness, that actually, when I look back, it's like, I can select what I want to remember, the emphasis on it. I can take what were difficult experiences and I can implot those experiences into a narrative that opens up more possibility for me in the present. Or I can take those very same events and be like, well, you see, I failed here and I failed there and I'm a failure and I should be ashamed of myself. And that closes off possibilities. So depending on how we're using it, and you've heard me use that word possibility a lot, and this is very Heideggerian in its essence of like, we are beings of possibilities. So I think the more possibilities you can open for yourself and for others, that's what Heidegger calls authentic relating. He calls it leaping ahead instead of leaping in.
Okay. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So if we rely on historians and on collective understandings of what happened in the past, but through the work of historians, the person may think that their narratives they're referring to construct their own understanding of time's flow. If the narrative they're relating to is something that you would consider negative, but that person might think that that narrative is opening up possibilities of being. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, that's
like this idea of trusting or what is that?
So I'd like to bring it back to spirituality.
Okay, please do.
Let's take a thorny example of a conflict in the Middle East right now. When I was in Israel, I came across this textbook that had the same events being narrated on one page from the Palestinian perspective, on the other page from the Israeli perspective. So you would have, quote unquote, the same exact thing, 1967 war, and you see how it is completely different, the narration, the emphasis, etc. And so you might have either on an Israeli or a Palestinian side, somebody who wants to tell a particular version of history that they are saying is going to open up more possibilities for their people. And let's just take the example of, the protests that were happening on college campuses last spring, which tended to be very pro-Palestinian. Those people were giving history lessons to say, okay, don't you see Israel has been the colonizer, the demon, they've done it here, 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 and here. And again, there's this moral sense of like, that's wrong and the injustice should be rectified. And so the future aspiration is either for a Palestinian state or even for the elimination of the state of Israel in some cases. And so somebody who's narrating a history like that might be saying, yeah, I'm opening up possibilities for my people. And then that could happen on the other side too. I think that we need as a species to transcend us versus them if we are to survive in the future. And this is where the spiritual dimension comes in. So the opening up of possibilities can't just be for you and your clan and your tribe and your nation, but it has to be for all of humanity.
So a possibility is not a possibility if it doesn't open possibilities for the collective, including us and them, overcoming the us and them.
And on an even larger sense, us and the biosphere as well, because we are part of an us called the Earth that is, without millions of other species. And so can we tell a story that's going to open up the most possibilities for the most amount of beings?
Not just for me or we, but you and I, and the broader world around us.
That was adaptive for a very long time, tribal history. But now we're getting to the point where I think it was like, there's somebody, I forget the philosopher who said, we have Paleolithic bodies with medieval institutions and modern technology. It's a recipe for disaster, right? Because we're being driven by our emotions and our tribal affiliations, and now we have the means to completely destroy the planet. So I feel like it's an imperative. It's like either we transcend this dualistic us versus them thinking, or it's my belief that will be one of the prime reasons for why we go extinct.
So you're touching upon one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, and that was Buddhism and history. Because through my work, I look at how people do history in the everyday. And I believe fundamentally that if you're able to interpret time's movement, then that is history. So I'm trying to move away from this reliance on the historian. And I won't get into it. Like, you can read the book or you can look at or listen to my podcast. But I'm just curious about what you said earlier about the historian and us looking to the historian, then what you said now about possibilities being not just for the self, but that encompasses the self, the other, and the biosphere. What about history and Buddhism? Do you know a little bit about what Buddhism says about history, and how does that connect to your understanding of history? Because earlier on, you talked a lot about Buddhism. So I'm assuming that you identify as a Buddhist more so.
Like if I had to put myself in a box, I'm a Buddhist practitioner that's very open to other traditions and practices. I would say to a certain extent, history is not really important for Buddhism.
Interesting.
I mean, it is and it isn't. Because the purpose of Buddhism is to catalyze awakening. The premise, the underlying worldview is that actually we are all Buddhas, only we don't recognize it. And so every tool that Buddhism puts out there in meditation and otherwise is geared to you waking up to that reality. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, he was the first person to do that in our time and on our world. So he opened up possibilities and consciousness for others. So should we study those examples? Of course. They're important to inform us, to let us know, okay, this is possible and here's how he did it. But the focus should always be on how am I going to use that to awaken myself now not to get hung up on worshiping the Buddha. It's like when I went to Asia and especially Thailand, I had this idealized image of like, oh, these people are going to meditate all the time. Nonsense. There's a golden Buddha statue on every corner. And so they're basically doing exactly what the Buddha told them not to do, which is don't turn me into an idol. Don't turn me into something to worship. Don't think that I've got something that you haven't, right? Use me as an example to catalyze and to stimulate your own possibilities of enlightened consciousness.
Do you have any final thoughts or words you'd like to share?
I would like to say that this is tied into a lot of what I've said, that I want to make a very broad claim that I think all of our problems, both individually and collectively, can be traced back to disembodiment and a refusal to feel.
I'm going to have to ask you another question now.
All right.
Can you connect what you just said to your understanding of history?
Let's take the Israeli-Palestinian example again. When you have one side with a particular narrative that like is stereotypically ethnocentric, what that tends to exclude is actually feeling what the other side is going through. Like, oh, if they are suffering, then that their suffering doesn't count, But like if you're a right-wing hardliner Israeli and you see a Gazan child suffering, do you feel that in the same way that you would feel an Israeli child suffering and vice versa? So if we can open our hearts, that will allow us to revisit and refine our historical narratives, to be able to see, hey, there's humans on the other side that are way more similar to me than I think. And maybe I need to imagine a future that's also good for them, just like it's good for me and good for us.
Daniel Goldsmith, thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Paul. It was a real pleasure.